England entered the year with storms gathering on every side as danger moved toward the kingdom from two powerful directions, and although most people remember the famous fight at Hastings, there was another clash earlier that truly set the stage for everything that followed in that troubled year when the struggle for the English throne reached its breaking point, and the fate of the entire land was placed in the hands of king's commanders and tired soldiers, who marched across hills, rivers, and long, winding roads. Before the Normans ever placed a single boot on English soil, a different threat rose in the north, when the final great Viking army to ever reach British shores set sail with a fierce purpose to take the crown and place England under Norse rule once more, and leading this bold force was the feared and respected Viking King Harald Hardrada, a man whose name carried weight from the cold north all the way to the warm markets of distant lands. By his side rode Tostig Godwinson, the exiled brother of England's new king, a man filled with anger after losing his power title and homeland, and because of this shared ambition they joined their strength together and crossed the sea with thousands of battle-hardened warriors who descended upon the north with a ferocity not seen in England for many years, and their first great blow came at Fulford, where they tore apart the local English defense in a brutal clash that left the path open for deeper invasion. Harald Godwinson, who had only recently taken the throne, faced a terrible and heavy choice because England was threatened from both ends, and whichever direction he turned left the other side exposed and in danger, and yet he had to act quickly for the survival of his people, so he made a difficult decision that would become known as one of the greatest forced marches in medieval history, when he led his men on a journey of roughly 300 kilometers completed in just 9 demanding days. Surprising every Viking who believed the English army could not possibly cover such a distance with that speed. What waited at the end of this march was not merely another battle, but a final test of endurance and will that marked the closing chapter of the long age of Viking power, as a small group of Norse warriors prepared to make their desperate stand at a wooden bridge that would soon become a symbol of courage and tragedy, and their stand nearly altered the future of England forever. The events that led to this moment began months earlier, when the kingdom fell into turmoil after the passing of King Edward the Confessor, who died in January without leaving a child to inherit the throne, and although his reign had brought years of relative calm, his death left behind an empty seat that immediately drew the attention of 3 different men, each powerful enough to challenge the others and each determined to take control of England by right claim or force. The first to act was Harald Godwinson, the Earl of Wessex, and one of the most capable nobles in the land, whose leadership skills, strong alliances, and military experience made him the natural choice to hold the kingdom together after Edward's death, and the English council, known as the Witan, agreed that he was the person most suited for the role, and so they crowned him King Harald II, just 1 day after Edward was laid to rest. But Harald knew the crown upon his head rested on shaky ground, because across the sea in Normandy another claimant was preparing to strike. And this man was William, the Duke of Normandy, a leader known for his ambition, his strict discipline, and his readiness to use force whenever it suited his goals. And William insisted that King Edward had once promised him the English throne, and he also declared that Harold had sworn an oath in past years to support his claim, which gave William the excuse he needed to raise a massive invasion fleet during the spring and summer of that same year. Yet, even William was not the only rival for Harold, because from the cold north came a man whose reputation had been formed through decades of battles, travels, and victories, and this man was Harald Hardrada, who many called the hardest ruler of his age because of the fear he inspired, and the life he had lived as a young exile-turned-mercenary warrior who served princes in Kievan lands and later commanded the finest troops of the Eastern Empire, known as the Varangian Guard, in the grand city of Constantinople. Hardrada had fought in distant wars, gathered great wealth, and carved his legacy with steel before returning to Norway to take his own throne, and although his claim to England was thin, based on an old agreement between earlier rulers, he saw opportunity in the unrest, and believed that England could be taken by force, especially since Harald Godwinson was focused on the southern coast preparing for the Norman threat, leaving the north seeming open and unprotected. His hopes grew even stronger when he gained an ally who understood England better than most men, and that ally was Tostig Godwinson, the bitter brother of the English king, who had been stripped of his position as Earl of Northumbria and cast out, which filled him with resentment and a strong desire to take revenge, and so he promised Hardrada support, knowledge, and guidance in return for a chance to reclaim what he had lost. With Tostig's insight and Hardrada's determination, the Viking plan gathered strength, as ships, men, and weapons were brought together, forming a great fleet unlike anything England had seen in many years, and while King Harald guarded the south, believing the main danger would come from Normandy, the true storm was rising far away across the northern seas, and it was about to crash into England with sudden violence. All through the warm months Hardrada prepared his fleet of around 300 ships carrying possibly 7,000 to 9,000 warriors ready not for a raid as earlier Vikings had done, but for a complete takeover of the kingdom, and as summer faded he sailed first to the Orkney Islands to gather more support before turning toward the English coast with his powerful ally Tostig, joining him there bringing not only men but also deep knowledge of the land he once ruled. By the time September arrived the Vikings were ready to strike, and they sailed boldly into the Humber, and then into the rivers that carried them toward the heart of Yorkshire, aiming directly for the great northern city of York, whose leaders Earl Edwin and Earl Morcar were brave men but woefully unprepared for an army of such size, experience and readiness, and now trapped in a desperate moment, they struggled to gather a defense as the Viking tide surged closer with each passing hour. When the northern leaders Edwin and Morcar learned that the Viking army had reached their lands, they moved quickly to gather their men, and formed a defensive line near the village of Fulford, hoping to block the invaders before they could reach York. And although they chose a strong position with one side protected by the river, and the other by marshy ground, they were soon tested by the sheer strength and experience of Hardrada's warriors who pressed against them with relentless force. At first the English shield wall held steady, and pushed back the early Viking assaults as shield struck shields, and the air filled with shouts, the ring of steel, and the cries of wounded men. But Hardrada was a seasoned commander who understood the flow of battle, and he watched closely for any sign of weakness as the struggle continued hour after hour along the riverbank. Later accounts suggest that he used a clever tactic by drawing the English line toward the difficult marshy ground while preparing a fierce and decisive strike on the flank near the river, and once his elite fighters moved in with full strength, the shield wall collapsed into confusion, leaving the English army broken as many fled into the river where they drowned while others were cut down as they tried to escape across the fields. Fulford ended in a devastating loss for the English defenders, and with their army scattered York was left exposed and forced to surrender to Hardrada, who took supplies, hostages and influence, but instead of burning the city or looting it as earlier Vikings might have done, he offered the Northumbrians peace if they would support his claim, which showed that he did not come merely to raid but to rule. Feeling confident with his early victory, Hardrada moved his army a short distance to Stamford Bridge on the River Derwent, where he waited for the promised hostages to arrive, and with morale high and no sign of an English army anywhere near, the Vikings relaxed under the warm September sun, many removing their heavy mail armor because the weather felt too hot for such burdensome gear, and their ships, which held most of their equipment, were moored several miles away, leaving them dangerously unprepared. Meanwhile, far to the south, King Harald Godwin's son had received the shocking news of Hardrada's arrival and victory, and although his southern army had been dismissed earlier in the month because supplies were running low, he wasted no time gathering his elite housecarls and the troops still loyal and ready to fight, and he began a forced march north that would become legendary for its speed, endurance, and discipline. Covering nearly 300 kilometers in around 9 days, Harald and his men moved at a pace that few armies in medieval Europe could match, pushing through long days and short nights with almost no rest, because they knew that if the Vikings gained full control of the north, the kingdom would be torn apart before William of Normandy even set foot on English soil. The exhaustion in Harold's army must have been immense, but the determination among the soldiers grew stronger as they approached their homeland in the north, and people in the villages cheered for them as they passed, offering whatever food and water they could spare, and word quickly spread that the king was coming with astonishing speed, something no Viking scout had predicted. By September 25 Harold's army marched straight through York, welcomed as saviors by the frightened citizens, and then continued towards Stamford Bridge, where the unarmored Vikings waited, unaware that their moment of triumph was about to turn into a desperate fight for survival. And as the English forces crested the rise near the river, the sunlight flashed on their shields, swords, and helmets, creating a sight that would strike fear across the Viking camp. For the men relaxing along the riverbank, the first sign of danger was not a war cry but the glitter of steel in the distance, followed by the growing cloud of dust kicked up by thousands of marching feet, and once scouts ran closer, the truth became clear: the English king had arrived far sooner than anyone thought possible, and panic spread like wildfire among the Viking ranks as they scrambled to grab weapons and run toward the bridge. Because many had left their armor behind, they faced the terrible truth that they would have to fight fully armed English soldiers with almost nothing but their courage, shields and axes, and as the English army charged down the slope, they smashed into the Vikings holding the west side of the river, and the clash lasted only moments before the unprepared defenders broke and fled toward the wooden bridge, shouting for their comrades to help them. The narrow bridge became the single point on which the fate of the Viking army now rested, because if the English managed to seize it, the battle would be lost within minutes. And as the fleeing men crowding the bridge tried to cross back toward the main force, one Viking warrior stepped forward to hold the crossing alone, choosing to sacrifice himself so his comrades could form a proper line on the other side. Later stories describe this man as a giant armed with a huge Dane axe who planted his feet in the center of the narrow structure, and dared the English to come at him one by one, and because the bridge allowed only a small number to approach at once, he cut down each soldier brave enough to challenge him, and in these accounts he held back the entire enemy army for what seemed like an eternity. Some tales say he single-handedly killed dozens of English fighters as his axe rose and fell while the roar of battle echoed across the water, and although the exact number is lost to legend, his bravery was remembered in both English and Norse tradition as a stand that bought critical time for Hardrada to gather the remaining Vikings on the opposite bank. But no warrior, no matter how strong, can stand forever, and once the English realized they could not defeat him head-on, they used a more cunning approach when one soldier is said to have floated beneath the bridge in a small boat and thrust a spear upward through the wooden planks, striking the lone defender from below and bringing his heroic stand to a painful end as he fell, and the English surged across at last. With the crossing now open, the English army prepared for the main clash against the Viking shield wall which had formed on higher ground waiting for the inevitable attack, and with the heroic guardian of the bridge gone, the full weight of the English force moved forward to meet Hardrada's men, who braced themselves for the struggle that would decide the future of the north, and perhaps the entire kingdom. As the English soldiers crossed the bridge in force, they looked up at the rising ground ahead, where the Viking shield wall stood waiting, a solid formation of shields locked together with spears pointing outward like the spines of a living creature determined to survive, and within that wall stood Harald Hardrada carrying his great banner called the Landwaster, a symbol feared throughout the north, and respected even by his enemies. Many of the Vikings were still without full armor because they had left their heavy mail shirts near their distant ships, yet they had gathered quickly, and now faced the English with fierce determination, knowing their only hope was to stand firm and trust their discipline and courage. And before the fighting began, the English king rode forward hoping to speak with Tostig, Godwin's son, his exiled brother, who stood among the Viking leaders. According to later saga traditions, Harald offered Tostig forgiveness and the chance to regain his former position as earl if he abandoned the Vikings and returned to the English side, and for a moment Tostig seemed tempted by the offer, but when he asked what reward Hardrada would receive if he surrendered, Harald replied that he would be granted 7 feet of English earth, and perhaps a little more if he was taller than most men, implying that the Norwegian king would receive only a grave. Tostig refused the offer, choosing instead to remain with the man he had pledged to help, and Harald rode back to his lines where his soldiers waited in silence until he gave the signal, and the English warriors charged forward with thunderous force as their boots shook the ground and their war cries filled the air. The first crash of steel against shields echoed across the battlefield when the English housecarls hurled themselves at the Viking wall with incredible power, their axes swinging in wide arcs while the Vikings braced their shields and pushed back with all their strength, and the two armies met in a fierce contest of endurance that lasted hour after hour without clear advantage to either side. The Vikings, though lacking armor in many cases, fought with a desperate energy born from the knowledge that retreat was impossible and their survival depended on holding the line, and their shields pressed together so tightly that the English struggled to break through even with heavy blows from their axes which struck the top edges of the round shields, hoping to smash them apart. As the battle raged, the sun hung high in the sky, and the heat wore down both armies, but especially the Vikings, who had marched into battle wearing little more than shirts and helmets while facing an enemy in full armor, yet they refused to yield, and continued to meet each English assault with stubborn resistance and loud shouts meant to strengthen their courage. Hardrada watched the struggle from within the shield wall, and when he saw that the English were pushing harder, he stepped forward in a moment of bold fury, grabbing his great two-handed sword, and entering the fray with the wild energy of a man who had seen victory and death many times before, and as he swung his blade, the sagas say it cut a wide path through the English ranks, driving them back, and inspiring the Vikings to press forward. His power on the battlefield was legendary, and for a moment it seemed as if the tide might shift in favor of the Norsemen as the English line trembled under his sudden assault, but Hardrada's courage carried a terrible cost, because by stepping out from the safety of the shield wall, he exposed himself to arrows flying through the air, and in a single moment an English arrow struck him in the throat, ending his life as he collapsed to the ground, while those around him shouted in shock and grief. The fall of Hardrada sent a wave of despair across the Viking line, for he had been the heart of their army, and many warriors looked to him for direction and strength, and now leaderless they wavered as the English pressed harder, sensing that their enemies had suffered a devastating loss. Command then passed to Tostig, who tried to fill the void by lifting the fallen banner of the Landwaster, and urging the Vikings to continue the fight, and the sagas say that he too refused another offer of mercy from his brother, choosing instead to meet his fate beside the Norse king he had supported. With renewed determination, the English launched another fierce assault, and the Vikings began to buckle under the pressure as their weakened shield wall grew thinner and gaps opened between the shields, allowing English soldiers to break through. And once the formation lost its shape, the battle shifted sharply in favor of King Harald, whose housecarls pressed deep into the Norse ranks, cutting down many who still fought with desperate courage. Tostig himself fell in this violent struggle, and with his death the Viking army began to crumble as men pulled back in disorder, hoping to regroup or reach the river where they might find a way to escape. But the English did not let up, sensing that the battle hung within their grasp, and they advanced steadily across the field, pushing the remaining Vikings back step by step. Just when it seemed the fighting would end, a sudden roar rose from the far side of the field, as the Viking reinforcements finally arrived from their ships at Rickcall, having run more than 10 miles in heavy armor to reach the battlefield, and though exhausted they threw themselves into the fight, hoping to save what remained of their army. These men were led by a warrior called Eystein in Norse tradition, and their arrival momentarily lifted Viking spirits as they charged into the English lines with tremendous force, driven by loyalty and grief. But the long run had drained their strength, and many collapsed soon after entering the battle, unable to continue. The English, who were also tired but better positioned, managed to absorb the impact of this final charge, and then surrounded the exhausted reinforcements, cutting them down in brutal close combat. And once this final effort failed, the Viking army had nothing left to give as men began to run or throw down their weapons. The field soon turned into a scene of grim devastation as the remaining Vikings tried to flee toward the river Derwent, where many were cut down before reaching the water, while others drowned in their attempt to escape, and the English secured a complete victory, though their own losses were heavy, and the exhaustion felt among Harold's troops was immense after so many hours of hard fighting under the warm sun. When the fighting finally settled, the ground around Stamford Bridge was covered with fallen warriors from both sides, and the scale of the Viking defeat became clear as only a small number of survivors remained able to stand, while the rest either lay dead or had fled into the river, where many drowned during the desperate retreat. And King Harald Godwinson surveyed the battlefield, knowing he had won one of the greatest victories in English history, yet also aware that the cost to his own army had been terribly high. Among the surviving Vikings was Olaf, the young son of Hardrada, and Harald allowed him and a small group to leave on the condition that they swore never to attack England again, and this act of mercy contrasted sharply with the brutality of the day, as the English king understood that continued bloodshed would bring no further benefit. When the time came for the surviving Vikings to return home, they found that the great fleet, which had carried thousands of warriors across the sea, now required only a fraction of its ships to take the defeated army back to Norway. And of the roughly 300 vessels that had begun the invasion, only around 24 were said to be needed to carry the survivors home, showing how complete the destruction had been. For Harald Godwinson, the victory brought temporary peace in the north, and incredible glory for his swift march, the surprise attack, and the bravery of his housecarls, who had fought through exhaustion to defeat one of the most fearsome warriors of the age. But even as the cheers of his men rose around him, he knew that the struggle for his kingdom was far from finished. The soldiers who had marched nearly 300 kilometers, fought a long battle and suffered heavy losses, were now weary and wounded, and though they had beaten the Viking army, they were in no condition to face a fresh invasion. Yet fate was already pushing them toward another great challenge, as news began to travel up from the southern coast carrying the warning Harald had long feared. Just 3 days after the victory at Stamford Bridge, a messenger arrived, breathless and shaken, bringing word that William of Normandy had landed his army on English soil at Pevensey without meeting resistance, because the southern forces had been dismissed earlier in the month, and the Normans now established themselves securely, while Harald and his men were still recovering in the north. The irony of the moment was cruel, because Harald's triumph over the last great Viking king had secured the north, but it also left his army dangerously weakened and out of position to face the Norman threat, and if he delayed, William would strengthen his foothold, gather supplies, and march freely across the countryside, forcing Harald to act with the little strength he had left. Without rest, Harald ordered his men to prepare for another long march, this time back toward the south, and once again the housecarls, who had already accomplished an extraordinary journey, lifted their shields and began the grueling trek across the length of England, as the weary king pushed his soldiers forward, driven by duty and the knowledge that the future of the entire kingdom depended on their speed and resolve. As the English army moved south, village after village watched the worn troops pass with bandaged limbs and torn clothing, yet still holding their weapons ready, and these people understood the weight carried by their king, who had saved the north, only to face a new and greater danger rising from across the channel, and each step brought Harald closer to the confrontation he had hoped to avoid until his army was strong again. Less than 3 weeks after the triumph at Stamford Bridge, Harald and his remaining forces reached the hills near Hastings, where William's Norman army had already begun fortifying their position, and although the English soldiers were brave, their numbers had been greatly reduced, and their bodies weakened by the long marches and fierce battles that had drained their strength throughout the month. Even so, Harold chose to make a stand, trusting in the discipline of his shield wall which had carried English armies to victory for generations, and the English warriors held their ground on the ridge, as the Normans approached, under the leadership of William, who had waited for this moment for many years, and now intended to seize the English crown through force and strategy. The battle that followed was fierce and stretched on for many exhausting hours as Norman cavalry charged again and again against the English shield wall, which stood firm at first despite the fatigue of the men holding it, but eventually the losses suffered at Stamford Bridge began to show and cracks appeared in the formation, allowing the Normans to exploit openings and push deeper into the English defense. King Harald fought at the front with his housecarls just as Hardrada had done weeks earlier, and like the Viking king he too met his end on the battlefield, though the exact details of his death were later told in different ways by various accounts, yet all agree that with his fall the heart of the English resistance was broken, and the shield wall finally collapsed, allowing the Normans to claim victory. With Harold dead and his army defeated, William of Normandy moved forward to take control of England, and his triumph at Hastings became the turning point that reshaped the history of the island, while the battle at Stamford Bridge faded into the shadows of memory, even though it had played a crucial role in weakening the English army before the decisive fight in the south. The victory over Hardrada is often called a Pyrrhic triumph because although Harold won the field he lost the strength required to survive the next invasion, and historians have long debated whether he might have defeated William if he had not been forced to gather his men for a desperate march north, and then back south within such a short time. The end of the Viking threat at Stamford Bridge marked the close of nearly 3 centuries of Norse raids, invasions and influence in England, and with Hardrada's death, the Viking Age effectively came to its final end on that warm September afternoon, leaving behind stories of bravery, tragedy, and fierce determination that would be remembered for generations. Meanwhile, the Norman conquest brought a new chapter to England, shaping its language, culture, laws, and nobility in ways that continue to influence the world today, and the events of 1066 remain one of the most dramatic sequences in medieval history, as the kingdom endured 2 invasions, survived one through an incredible feat of endurance, and fell to the other when exhaustion left its defenders unable to hold their ground any longer. The story of Stamford Bridge endures because it captures the courage of men who fought against impossible odds, the decisions of leaders who faced overwhelming pressure, and the fragile nature of victory in a world shaped by war, ambition, and fate, and it reminds us that even the greatest triumph can carry a hidden cost that changes the course of history forever.